Good evening. I am Catherine Walker, Junior in Political Science and Senior Director of Governmental Affairs for Iowa State University's Student Government. It is my special honor to welcome you all here tonight. Before we begin, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of Political Science and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Committee on Lectures funded by Student Government. We would also like to announce two outstanding upcoming speakers. Ron Stallworth, the first African-American detective in the Colorado Springs Police Department who infiltrated the ranks of the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1970s, will speak on Thursday, January 24th at 6 p.m. in the Sunroom in the Memorial Union. And Brittany Packnett, Teach for America's Vice President of National Community Alliances and former teacher, policy expert, and nonprofit executive director who has committed her life and career to justice, will speak on Monday, January 28th at 7 p.m. in the Great Hall in the Memorial Union. Look for more information about these speakers and many more on the Iowa State University Lectures Program website. And now, here's Beda Schmidtman, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, to introduce our panel for the evening.
Well, good evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight for what I'm sure will be a very, very interesting and very exciting event. It's actually the capstone of a celebration that we had today where we recognized two of our political science faculty members as, new named faculty members in the Department of Political Science. And I really want to thank, first of all, Kent and Kristen Luken, who are sitting up front here, whose generous contributions established the endowment of these first named faculty positions in the Department of Political Science. Kent is an alumnus who received his bachelor's degree in political science from Iowa State University in 1986 and went on to receive his master's in public administration focused on finance from Harvard University in 2001. Kent and Kristen live in Newton Center, Massachusetts, where Kent is a managing director at Citi Private Bank in Boston and serves as the firm's North American head of financial sponsors. Kristen directs the Masters of Arts program in Global Studies at Brandeis University. This evening's panel discussion, American Politics After the 2018 Midterm Election, will be moderated by University Professor of Political Science, Stefan Schmidt, who was honored earlier today as the Luken Endowed Professor of Political Science at Iowa State University. Dr. Schmidt has been at Iowa State University since 1970 and is the author of 11 books, including the best-selling college textbook, American Government and Politics Today, which has been read by more than 3 million college students. He studied in Switzerland, in France, and graduated from a military academy in Jacksonville, Florida, and Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, and then went on to obtain his PhD from Columbia University in public law and government. He became University Professor of Political Science in 1994 and received the ISU Impact Award from ISU in 2004. Now on to our panelists for this evening, and you will see them here on stage shortly, and they will introduce themselves a little bit more. But they are Jennifer Jacobs, Bloomberg News senior White House reporter and Iowa State alumna, David Kochel, National Campaign Advisor and Iowa State alumnus, who served as chief strategist for Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign. Jonathan Martin, New York Times national political correspondent, and Jeff Zeleny, CNN senior White House correspondent. And I'm going to invite them to the stage now and turn the event over to Stefan, and please help me welcome Dr. Stefan Schmidt, Dr. Politics, and our panel. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dean Schmidtman, and all of the other Iowa State administrators, leaders, and of course, the wonderful family that has supported this event. They are great friends of the university, and we're so pleased to have them here. And we also want to express our thanks to this panel of great people who basically flew through storms and snow and shoveled their cars out at airports to be here tonight. So thank you very much. We talked about what we should do tonight, and I think the best way is to begin by asking each of them to talk a little bit about the 2018 election and something that they may have experienced during that period of reporting that we might have missed. So if you have any stories that you can tell that would be emblematic of what happened this year, that's what we'd like to start with. Then we'll move on and look at what might happen with the Democrats controlling the House over the next 2 years, and finish with a little bit of an insight into the 2020 elections and the Iowa caucuses. So that's the agenda. So why don't we start with Jeff? What happened this year, Jeff?
Well, good evening. It's great to be back in Iowa. Thanks to the Lukens and to Iowa State for having us. If there's one state in the country that political reporters love more than any state, it's Iowa. And I don't say that just because I'm from Nebraska next door, but I truly think I speak for everyone when I say it's great to be back in Iowa. But one surprise, I think, was the fact that President Trump decided to inject himself so much into the midterm elections. Presidents are always not on the ballot, but on the ballot, but he really made a lot of that. And boy, I remember thinking in June when he said he wanted to do 6 rallies a week. Like, he's the President of the United States. How does he have time for 6 rallies a week? Well, it turns out he made time for that and was at a lot of rallies. We spent a lot of time in red states, but I noticed a difference in terms of where we were traveling. It was not the states that helped deliver the presidency to Donald Trump 2 years ago. It was the red states that had Senate races, of course, but going back and back and back to Montana, to Missouri, to West Virginia, to other places. So that offers a window into his strengths and his challenges. But as much as we love Iowa, we also love midterm elections because they send us to states where we don't normally go in the presidential campaign. And Montana is the top of the list on that. And there was one person that President Trump wanted to defeat more than anyone, and that was Senator Jon Tester for Montana. So the president went there 4 different times. I wrote a story in the final weekend. No American president had ever visited the state of Montana as much as Donald Trump had in 2 years in office. I think President Roosevelt had visited a couple times, and once after he was president, he visited. But so President Trump was clearly focused on Montana, and he fell short in that race. But just watching the amount of Trump rallies, I closed election eve on the Monday before the midterm election day in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Rush Limbaugh was on stage. It's his hometown. Sean Hannity was doing his show right from the audience there, and the president came on. And he finished about 11 o'clock at night. It was his 3rd stop of the day, and they won that Missouri Senate race. But never before have we seen the president so involved in midterm races. But more interestingly, the places he didn't go, of course. So when you look at the story of the midterm elections, so many places in the country he couldn't go because some candidates didn't want him. And the House, of course, an entirely different story than the Senate. But increasingly, I think the big takeaway from the midterm elections was how entirely Trumpian it was.
Interesting. Jennifer?
And just to expand on that, Jeff is exactly right. I always thought that Air Force One was Trump's happy place. It's a place where he can go, he has free reign to pick up the phone and call whoever he wants. He can have them cook and whatever he wants, and he can eat whatever he wants. He likes to show off the plane. So I said to one of his aides, he's so happy because I was traveling with him on Air Force at one. Bloomberg News is part of the pool. So one of us is always in the 13-member pool that travels with the president no matter where he goes. So he was in a particularly just ebullient mood on that particular day, that Monday before the midterm elections when he did that rally-o-rama with the 3. And I said, I think it's because he likes to be on Air Force One. He's away from the White House. And one of his aides said, no, it's just that he associates being on Air Force One with going out to these rallies where he gets all this adoration. So a lot of things that Trump does comes back to ego and wanting praise and that naked neediness he has to always want people to be praising him and to be heaping worship on him. And that's one of the reasons why he loved those campaign rallies so much, is because he gets up in front of these crowds of 8,000 or however many people it is. He'll tell you it was 40,000. And just to have all those people standing there and praising his name. But we got back onto the plane after that last rally in Cape Girardeau, and I for one, was exhausted, and all 13 members of the pool were, I think, equally tired. It was midnight. We just wanted to drink a glass of wine maybe and kick back and maybe take a nap on the way back to Washington, D.C. And up in the front of the plane, unbeknownst to us, President Trump was saying, I want to go back. I want to go back and talk to the press. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders was up there, and she said, sir, it's really late. You know, they're probably tired. Are you sure you want to go back there? And he said, yeah, let's go back. Let's go back and talk to him. So we had just tucked into our blankets, and we're like falling asleep, exhausted. You know, these Trump rallies are so loud, and as we were leaving, somebody in the audience threw something, and something wet had hit my hair, and the bass volume of the speakers is always cranked way up, so you just have a headache from all the noise, and there's only so much of all this you can take. And so I just really wanted to go to sleep, and then all of a sudden, I'm looking out the window, and so one of the photographers goes, heads up! And sure enough, there's President Trump, and he wants to talk with us for like 45 minutes. And we had just taken off our shoes and ordered a glass of wine, and there he is. But he definitely thrived on that campaign politics, and I will just stress what Jeff said, which is it is striking, and I had forgotten how much his whole world is about campaigning and how that is his element. That he really proved that during the midterm elections.
Well, it's great to be home. I've come from Story City up the road, and my grandfather actually worked in this building as the manager of the Iowa State University bookstore back when they sold books. For 40 years, he had that job, and Jennifer and I are both alumni of Iowa State, so it's great to be back here. I've participated in my first caucus in this room, actually, in that room. I registered voters at tables out there. I signed up people for college Republicans and was in student government in this building as well, so it's great to be home, and Kent, great to see you and Kristen. I'm a practitioner of politics. These guys cover it, influence it, write about it, tell you about it. The job that I do is a little bit different. I was trying to figure out how to navigate Trump in 2018 from the other side. As a Republican, I was managing the message of Governor Kim Reynolds' campaign. I did some work for David Young as well, and trying to sort of operate in this environment where there is such a huge personality on the national stage, taking all of the oxygen out of the campaigns, making it a Trump election, and in a governor's race where you're not talking about national issues as much. It was a fairly tricky thing to navigate, and it was, we had Trump in the state twice. The Democrats were very excited about that, thinking that it was going to hurt our campaign. We took him to specific places. He didn't come to Des Moines. He went to Dubuque, a county that he was the first Republican to carry in, I think maybe in history. And we took him to Pottawatomie County, which is Council Bluffs, Council-tucky, as Jonathan likes to call it, the sort of the pit bulls and chain link fence country in Iowa. And
barbed wire tattoos.
And he exactly, if your tattoo's spelled correctly, you've got a good voter in Pottawatomie. I think it was a very interesting year to try and steer through all of that. Governor Reynolds was a Trump supporter. She didn't support anyone in the primary in 2016, but trying to find your way through that thicket of messages, having to sometimes answer for things that he was saying as a part of the sort of the daily cable news narrative was an interesting lesson, and it took a lot of discipline to stay focused, to stay on a message that didn't get caught up in the daily kind of melee of the Trump administration, that whole narrative that takes place out there. It was more difficult, I think, for the congressional candidates, for David Young and Rod Blum and some others, but for us in Iowa, you have, obviously he won the state by 9.5 points. He's got a lot of fans here, but it is a very complicated set of political kind of, not just ideology, but personality and ego to wade through. And I think my takeaway from 2018 was people who were successful in being able to navigate that, stay focused and disciplined on their message, were able to be successful in a time when we really struggled down the ballot in a lot of races in Iowa. We'll probably get to the suburbs later and talk about that as well, but there's a huge lesson for Republicans in the suburbs. We've got to figure that out going forward.
Well, thanks for having me. What a treat to be back in Iowa this time of year. The weather, the Chamber of Commerce, perfect. You could not have scripted this any better for visitors. Although it's something of a tragedy that I'm going to be in Ames when there's a home basketball game, and I'm neither going to get to a Cyclones game nor hit Hickory Park, which is a very rare moment for me to be in this town and not go to Hickory Park at some point. But I shall return frequently in 2019, I'm sure. When I think of the midterms, I can't help but think of one overriding theme, and that is a country that's pulling apart. It's undeniable. It is vivid if you saw it up close. The polarization that we write about, that you hear about, that we are constantly sort of infusing in our stories is not just some kind of dry, no offense, but political science type phrase. It is real. It's driving politics in this country. Campaigns increasingly are about the identity of the voter more than the identity of the candidate. That increasingly matters now more than the nature of the cycle, the nature of the candidates, the nature of the race. It's where is this election taking place? What is the demography of the voters? And that often tells you everything you need to know. I think of two examples that come fresh to mind that kind of underscore this pulling apart. And when I say pulling apart, you guys know what I'm talking about. College-educated voters increasingly are voting one way, and those that don't have a college degree are increasingly voting a different way. And we're sorting into red and blue along those lines. Two examples. The first one's December of 2017, so it was almost a year ago. I was in Houston, Texas, and I was doing a story with a colleague about what was then becoming more and more clear, which is the House GOP majority was in jeopardy because of their weakness in the suburbs, where there was this growing rejection of President Trump's brand of politics. And there is this very upscale House district in Houston that is basically, if you know Houston at all, it includes sort of River Oak, very affluent enclave. It's H.W. Bush country. In fact, it's where Bush 41 was in the House. He served in the House for 2 terms, had this seat. I was there in December because I was covering this trend in the suburbs, and here was this obvious example of a district that, since H.W. Bush won it in '66, had only been held by a Republican, and John Culberson was the incumbent. He lost the seat. And I was at this reception for one of the candidates, the Democrats who was running in the primary at the time. And this reception was a sort of like, kind of a half fundraiser. I was kind of smuggled in there. I was the only person there from the press corps. And it was a kind of women-focused event. It was on the top floor of this very Houston condo building. It turns out that Ken Lay of Enron fame used to actually live in the building. I mean, there were like more valets out front than the Des Moines Marriott at the height of the caucus season. I mean, it was super intense. And I had this conversation with a woman at the reception. And it's one of those conversations, if you cover politics, you guys know this, you immediately know, got it, like that's my quote, you know. And I used it in the lead of the story that I pulled up. And her name was Nancy Sharp, and she was an interior designer who had voted for the Bush family for years. And this is what she said to me, cutting to the quick, as only a Texas woman can do. I can't do the accent justice, but here's the quote. have you ever heard of a stupider and trashier man than the President of the United States? This is a Republican, a woman who had voted for the Bushes for years, and that was her quote talking about Donald Trump. That kind of voter is not going to vote for the Republican for Congress this time around because they're registering their dissatisfaction with the leader of the party. And not based on major policy objections, but based on the fact that they can't abide his conduct in office. And it was said to me in this sort of Texas accent that I can't do justice to, but that to me was a sort of moment where you kind of see where this thing is going. The other memorable moment that I have is right after the Brett Kavanaugh vote, I was in North Dakota, and I was in Bismarck. And this was October, and it was even colder than it is now in Iowa. And I tried to find like the most sort of, not trendy, but just an upscale type cafe that I could find in Bismarck on a Saturday morning because I wanted to find some voters who may be more Democratic leaning. I'd gone to one cafe that was like clearly the Republican hangout, and I wanted to find a place that was more Democratic leaning. And I found a place in Bismarck that had scones, they had lattes. I'm like, all right, I'm in the right place here, you know. I found my target. You know, to put it in Iowa terms, it was like the East Village in Des Moines. And so I go in there, and I'm looking around. Oh, yeah, this is going to be good. This is going to be good. I can get Democratic voices here to balance out the previous place. And I get my latte, got my scone, so I fit in. And I just, start walking around some tables. And it was probably the demographic there was 70-30 women to men. And I walk around these tables, and I'm talking to folks. Hey, pardon me, I just want to say hello. I'm a reporter from the New York Times. I'm doing a story about your Senate race out here. And I could barely find a Democrat there. And there were a few, but they were overwhelmingly Republicans. And here I was, this was going to be the sort of Democratic spot. It just didn't matter. And why are you voting for a Republican this time around? Well, I kind of like Heidi, but Democrats, they're just liberal. And it was much more based upon just their perception of where the national party was. Less about the candidates, less about Heidi Heitkamp or Kevin Cramer, and more just about, I'm a Republican, and that's my party, and she doesn't reflect that. I know Heidi Heitkamp. I've known her for years, but I can't vote for her. And so those two kind of takeaways to me spoke to what's happening in this country and what I saw in this election, which are these demographics that increasingly are pulling apart and doing so in a way that I think is cemented. I mean, I'm just not sure how this changes because it's less about policy and more about identity.
There was discussion at one point about Trump's personality creating this backlash, which would create a blue wave that would overwhelm the Republicans. So I'm wondering, was there a blue wave?
I think the answer is yes. In the House, the Senate is different because of the makeup of, of geography, where there were Republican seats up. Let's just talk about the House for a second, which didn't get as much national coverage. This was a very nationalized midterm election, as Jonathan was saying, no doubt about it. But we are up now to, Democrats have now won 38 seats. And there are 2 still outstanding, I believe, in New Mexico and California, so they could be up to 40 seats. I think that by any definition is a blue wave. The House districts, and if you look at the analysis of that, if you're like a real junkie about this, look at the districts, and a couple are in Iowa, like that explains a lot of it, but the suburbs drove everything in the House. Right. One of the races that I looked at a lot was South Carolina 1. Yeah. This was a great example of the consequences of the president and who he endorsed in a primary had ramifications in a general election. You've probably seen Mark Sanford on the news. Of course, he is a former governor from South Carolina. Then he's a member of Congress. He got into some hot water and his divorce, whatever, several years back. But he was largely he years ago would not have been described as a moderate Republican.
Not
But in
at
this
all.
era,
Not at
he,
all.
not at all, super conservative. In this era, he's a moderate Republican because he was willing to criticize some things the president did. In any case, the president decided at the last minute to endorse his opponent, Katie Arrington. So she went out, she was too conservative for the district. The Democrat ended up winning in the general election, a guy by the name of Joe Cunningham. So the first time in basically 3 decades, since '82, I believe, that a Democrat has held that seat, simply because the president endorsed the opponent in the primary. So I do think that there was a blue wave, and it's districts like that that sort of exemplify it. Now, how long will it last? We don't know the answer to that. I think there will be a lot of seats, all of those seats virtually in play. Now, an entire long conversation is California, where Jonathan spent a ton of time, entirely blue now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a blue wave within the architecture of politics circa 2018, which is to say that it's less fungible now, and I'm not sure that we're going to have waves as we may have known them previously because of what I was talking about. The country is locked in demographically, and so I think even compared to '06, it's harder to have those kinds of elections where you see waves across disparate states. So I think it was a wave. I think Democrats are going to win 40 seats. Valadao, who is the 40th seat, he's an incumbent Republican in the Central Valley of California, just lost his lead actually tonight. They're still counting ballots in California, and that's the 40th seat. So yeah, I think it's a wave under the current political system. The fact is it's just hard for Democrats to win in places like North Dakota and Missouri and Indiana these days. And so I think that limits the kind of scope of it. But 40 seats is the biggest Democratic pickup since the Watergate year of '74. So by any standard, that's
Maybe a blue
major year.
splash. Maybe that's the best way to characterize it, blue splash. And I know it definitely was this midterm wasn't great for Trump, but I had one GOP operative say that it was worse for the GOP. This was a fairly centrist Republican who said that this election really proved that the GOP has really been shaped in Trump's image. Right. And that was the big takeaway.
Yeah, they look, the bargain is clear, right? I mean, they became the Trump party, and in doing so, they effectively ceded, control of the House.
But a lot of the positions that Trump has taken are just a kind of a sharper manifestation of where the Republican Party has been going anyway, hasn't it? In other words, he didn't really sort of come out of nowhere with things that the Republicans totally objected to. It was just his style, maybe.
There's a hollowing out taking place right now. If you look at Mike Kaufman in suburban Denver, who lost David Young here in Iowa, you didn't lose the Steve Kings in this district. He only won by 3 or 4 points in a district that Governor Reynolds carried by 21. So he definitely underperformed, but that was a very unique set of circumstances to him. But it was the moderate candidates. It was the people who work across the aisle. A lot of those Orange County voters or members, and suburban Dallas, suburban Houston, suburban Chicago. Yep. So members that would forge compromise are now gone. We saw it in our Iowa House. We lost 4 Polk County legislative House members, and I think we gained a couple of Senate seats because we had the same map issue in the Senate. But a lot of the people who were the most likely to go build compromise with the Democrats are now gone, and so you're going to be left with a lot more strident Republican member of Congress than you had a couple of years ago. So that he has definitely hollowed out the middle. But that's what's the great sorting that Jonathan talked about. It's rural, urban, it's age, older voters, younger voters, it's college, non-college, it's white, non-white, it's sorted on income. I mean, there's so much. We used to look at, when we look at polling, you're looking through crosstabs to find these marginal 4 and 5 point places where you can really emphasize a message. Crosstabs have completely changed now, where you look at college, non-college, you look at, urban, exurban, suburban, and the difference in people's voting behavior now, as you look through crosstabs in a typical poll, in a governor's race or a congressional race, is vast. You talk about the gender gap, it's getting bigger on both sides. Most people think of the gender gap as a female issue. It's not. 12-point gender gap among men right now in Iowa, and was higher than that in a lot of other places. So we've got a huge sorting going on right now.
I take and accept your point, Stefan, about Trump sort of not breaking too much from the party, and in fact, kind of voicing positions that the base of the party would probably prefer. I mean, the dirty little secret is that the base of the party, or at least a lot of them, are just fine with protectionism, and they're certainly supportive of the hardline stance on immigration, two policies where the kind of elites of the party would not be comfortable with at all. So I think that's fair. I guess what I would differ a little bit with you is the suggestion inherent in your question that this is somehow based on policy. And I just don't see it like that. I think it's much more identity-oriented, and you have college-educated voters who see a president that frankly embarrasses them because of his conduct. Now, part of that's because of his comments on issues related to immigration and race. There's no question about it. But I think a lot of it is just how he conducts himself is just not to them how the president of the country should carry himself. And I think that's what they're voting on, even more than any kind of policy issue.
If you look at the very end of the campaign, we always discuss where the president is going, but equally important is where he wasn't going.
Correct.
They didn't want him. And in the final 10-day stretch, the president had raised the acrimony and the tone so much on immigration, the caravans coming. I mean, Republican campaign operatives did not want him to visit Arizona, did not want him to visit Nevada, because they worried that he was exciting Hispanic voters really for the first time. So they went on to, the Democrats went on to win Arizona and Nevada, knocked off a sitting Republican incumbent Senator Dean Heller. Now the president, he would argue, and has argued at the time and privately, well, if they would have sent me, they would have won. And we heard him at the day after the news conference, calling out these Republicans by name, like Mike Kaufman and Mia Love and others. People didn't embrace me. But the reality is, those candidates did not want him there at the end, and the Democrats won. So I think it was the tone and tenor more than the actual policies that was turning off voters at the end.
So now that the Democrats in this environment, highly polarized environment, have taken over the House, what do you see happening? How are they going to comport themselves? Are they going to build out their base to voters that voted for them plus additional voters? What do you see coming out of that?
Well, I think the big question is, are Democrats going to overreach? And if history offers us a lesson, they probably will in the House. So that will be Nancy Pelosi's biggest challenge if she becomes Speaker, and I do believe she probably will, absent any alternative. Although you probably saw from ads, you would think that Nancy Pelosi was running in about 100 districts in America because she was the biggest kind of villain, if you will. But all that said, I do think she'll probably be the Speaker. We'll see how much she can control things. But the biggest thing that the White House is just sort of figuring out now, it's investigations and tax returns, I think. Will the House Democratic chairman and leaders get the president's tax returns? What type of oversight will they do? You don't hear the I word as much as you heard in the summer, impeachment. But if Democrats go there, I think it's probably a loser for them. But I don't foresee much policy getting done, with the exception of perhaps infrastructure or something else. But this is a big moment for the Democratic Party as they look forward to 2020, how they conduct themselves right now. And boy, as Jonathan was saying earlier, I'll steal a line from him, it's not just one party, there's a couple different parties inside the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
So
Jennifer,
that's
how
the
about
issue.
that?
Well, it's less clear, I think, what's going to happen after January, but I know for the next few months, that's what we've been working on in the last couple days of trying to figure out what the Republicans are going to do in their last months here. And I know McConnell said today that he has a long list of things to get done in the lame duck session, including finishing nominations for President Trump. And Chuck Grassley told one of our reporters today he wishes that Trump would just pick a new AG. Grassley would like to have seen Trump name a new AG yesterday, is how Grassley phrased it. So we'll be focused on that. It sounds like McConnell doesn't want to spend a lot of time debating criminal justice reform, but I think we'll see that in the lame duck. We'll see something with NAFTA, whatever it is, the US, Mexico, Canada agreement, or whatever Trump renamed it. So I think it's who knows what's going to happen after January. We're still so focused on just the next week or two, what's going to happen, and I think that's a basic sketch.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo those comments. My guess is that the House will pass a number of bills to sort of demonstrate their governing capability, and Mitch McConnell will keep those bottled up in the Senate. I can see some cooperation, not on kind of major issues, but I can see some cooperation to try to keep the government moving. I think Mitch McConnell has made clear over the years he does not like government shutdowns. So I think that it'll be in their interest to at least keep the government running. It's not much of an accomplishment, I guess, but...
Immigration reform will be the big tipping point there for whether there's a government shutdown, whether they can reach an agreement on
money for the wall.
money for the wall.
Is there a consensus among Democrats on these issues?
Absolutely not. I mean, half of the Democratic Party, a lot of them, let's abolish ICE, other things. So no, the Democratic Party has been, as the Trump show has been playing out and the Trump presidency has been playing out, he consumes a lot of oxygen. And that's a whole nother separate discussion if it's the media's fault for giving him too much or his fault for taking too much. But the reality is he controls a lot of the spotlight. What's been playing out beneath the surface is this identity crisis inside the Democratic Party. So we are about to see that unfold, in real time about what the direction of the party is. Is it the party of Bernie Sanders? Is it the party of Joe Biden? It's not, a lot of decisions have to be made. So that's the argument that Nancy Pelosi makes privately, that she's the best one to sort of herd all of this. Now others will say, of course, it's time for new blood, but she's probably one of the savviest politicians in Washington, like her or not. So we'll see what happens with that. But no, the Democrats can't find agreement on a lot of things.
Yeah, it's, to borrow an Iowan, it's not quite like, trying to absorb Henry Wallace and Strom Thurmond in the same party, which is obviously what FDR did, or the sort of FDR coalition was pretty unwieldy. But it's moving in that direction. I mean, this is kind of the challenge that Democrats have. I guess it's the mixed blessing of their success is that in absorbing these suburbanites into their coalition, they're really creating a much more unwieldy coalition because you're going to have, everybody from the kind of country club, voter who just couldn't abide Trump to, like Sanders-style socialist. That's a pretty broad coalition in American politics to have. And so how do they find consensus behind an agenda, behind a presidential nominee? I think that could be a challenge. What does unite them right now is a common adversary, Donald Trump. I mean, he's the best thing going for today's Democratic Party because, eyes on the prize, right? That's their common enemy.
Well, and even if the House decides not to take up impeachment, of course, we'll know probably in a few months what Mueller's going to do. They may not have a choice but to talk about impeachment when you have Tom Steyer still on the air in Iowa right now running ads on impeachment. So it's not like they've got the ability to control the whole agenda. There are other candidates who are going to be coming in, some of whom are not currently serving in Congress or the Senate, and they'll be in part dictating what voters are talking about, what the media is talking about, what gets covered. So I think the ability for Speaker Pelosi to control what the message is vis-a-vis Trump coming out of this, this upcoming session is muted by the fact that a presidential campaign does kind of subsume everything. Candidates who are running here in Iowa and New Hampshire and around the country will take over at some point. It won't be right away in January, but it won't take very long before the presidential campaign and the primary really moves to the fore.
You notice David is the master of transition because, of course, that's where we want to go, right? We want to talk about, okay, the Democrats are going to do whatever they can in the House. They're going to try to hang together, pardon the expression. But already we're talking really about the move into the 2020 election. I did an interview with The Hill this afternoon, and she wanted to know if the Iowa caucuses were still relevant, given the fact that California has moved up its primaries, and California going to become really the big news story because, Iowa has very few delegates to a convention and very few electoral votes. What are you seeing now looking towards the caucuses? Who's running and what is it going to look like? Have you got some inkling already on that?
You're getting an inkling in the final weeks of the midterms here, just by all the Democrats who are coming into a campaign. And so I think every sort of major and minor Democrats have been in, with the exception of Elizabeth Warren, so I assume she'll be coming soon. Look, there are going to be a ton of candidates, and this is going to really put to test why campaigns matter and campaigns are important. We have no idea who the nominee is going to be. Whoever wins is going to be put through the rigors. And I like to remind everyone and Democrats, because we think that Barack Obama, as history will say, oh, he was this incredible candidate, defeated Hillary Clinton. He was a terrible candidate in all of 07, or most of 07. And it wasn't until November in 07 at Veterans Auditorium in Des Moines where he sort of rose up, and he was all or nothing at that moment at the JJ dinner in Des Moines to rise up to be the candidate. So the best candidate is not there right now. You do not want to be the candidate of the winter of 2019 or the spring of 2019 because that doesn't usually work that well. So we don't know who is going to be the best candidate. The question, does Iowa matter? Iowa, the caucuses are protected by a tradition and inertia, and whenever it gets around to having the conversation, it's too late because people are already here. So the idea of California, I think, it's expensive, it's impersonal, and the Iowa caucuses, in my view, absolutely matter. Will some decide to not play as aggressively and look at New Hampshire or South Carolina? I think they probably will, but Iowa absolutely matters because if you win here, that propels you out. If you skip here, you miss that opportunity.
And I told this reporter, we have the best hay bales for a campaign in Iowa for the candidates to sit on. Or Jesse Jackson, who held up a little tiny pig this far away, he had on a three-piece suit. You can't get that in many other states.
The economy's changed a lot, though, since '88 when Jesse Jackson ran.
You can't campaign in an arugula field. Doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Some Iowa politics watchers have told me just in the last few weeks they hope Iowa doesn't host the first in the nation vote. They're just burned out on all of the negative campaigning and feeling a little bit disenfranchised. But I think they forget that that's how Iowans feel after every election cycle. It always gets brutal. But they're particularly, and these are people who are very engaged in politics, just rank and file voters, but just tired of all the negative advertising, and they feel like whichever Democrat challenges Trump is going to have to play just as dirty politics as Trump has shown he's willing to play, and they're just braced for that, or not looking forward to it at all, and they know that whatever Democratic candidate they pick is going to have to engage in that same level of nastiness. But Iowa is, I think, definitely going to be the kickoff place. Somebody told me tonight that, of course, where else it would be as inexpensive for people to go if you don't have a lot of money. You can start in Iowa without a whole lot of money if you need to advertise and get to know people. Iowa's a good place to do that. What other state are they going to go to? Is it going to be Florida? I mean, you look at the states that have come out in the wash as the swing states for the next election, and it's Wisconsin and Minnesota and Florida. And Iowa's going to be more likely for people to get kicked off. And what Jeff said, the inertia is what's going to keep Iowa in the game.
David, is there going to be a Republican presidential primary?
I would guess there's going to be a primary. I don't know that it'll be consequential.
You don't think there'll be a challenger to Trump at all?
I think there will be a challenger.
Yeah.
I think it'll be.
You have a name?
The Iowa, no.
I mean, you
I
know
got a few.
everything about the
Sure.
Republicans, so you probably have a name,
I
right?
have a few names, but I don't think anybody's ready to say. So, well, I mean, Kasich will probably run.
Lucan.
Yeah, Lucan for president.
Lucan can run,
That's
yeah.
what I'm for. I think there are people.
Midwest
who will run.
roots. No?
He'll be like Tom Harkin, the favorite son. You know, there's no
Yes,
chance that
exactly.
Trump will win.
I think it's a loser unless
Yeah.
something happens in February or March of this year with Mueller, and you know we can't predict the future with this president. It's everybody who's tried to do it has been wrong, and so I think there is no opportunity in the environment that we're presented with now. That might change in a month or 3 months or 6 months, but the amount of loyalty he has from the base of this party is remarkable. And it is, as Jonathan said, it's not policy-based. It is very much a personality-based affect. And he will win a primary against almost anyone unless something big changes. And with Trump, it's important to always remember that things change. So I doubt it. I don't see it now. And you wouldn't come through Iowa, I don't think, anyway. I think this would be the wrong place to try it. I think New Hampshire has a little bit different political culture. They're flinty and maybe a little more disagreeable generally.
Well, independents can vote, too.
And independents can vote. And you come up from Massachusetts and vote same day. That's
not true.
Well, kind of true. You can if you say you're going to be a resident. You can vote.
Okay, but there's no mass voter fraud. We don't want to perpetuate that idea.
No, I'm not going to perpetuate the voter fraud rumors, but it is true. In New Hampshire, things are done a little differently.
I knew the Iowans were very protective of their caucuses, but going negative on the New Hampshire primary here was more than
hear
I
me.
expected at tonight's.
You should hear me talk about Illinois.
At tonight's event. Yeah. Although I actually recall Bill Clinton was musing privately before the caucuses here in 2016 about how he thought that. In fact, I think he was musing in 2008 too about how he was convinced that, that folks were coming from Illinois to vote.
Oh, yeah.
I guess for Obama in 08, and then it was for Bernie in 16.
That didn't explain why Hillary Clinton got third here in 08 as opposed to second,
Yeah,
which is
exactly.
also lost to history.
I guess the question is, were the same folks from Illinois voting for Obama in 08 and then Bernie again in 16 in the mind of Bill Clinton? So at the risk of never being invited to have a tenderloin in this town again, let me say this. I do think the Iowa caucuses will obviously play a huge role this cycle. To the point that Jeff made, the calendar works in their favor. By the time there's a thought about trying to kill it off, the candidates are already coming here. And I think that that inertia, and let's be honest, I think the candidates come here for the same reason that folks, you know, what's the old saying about Willie Sutton, you know, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is, right? The candidates that come here, I think, oftentimes because we're here, because the press is here. Sure. And so I think that drives a lot of it. That said, and again, I don't want to get struck down here in Iowa. I look around here for lightning bolts. I do wonder how much longer Democrats are going to keep starting their campaigns here. I think that the modern Democratic Party is increasingly diverse, and I think that there will be a push at some point to move it somewhere else, or to sort of take turns and to kind of broaden out how they start their nominating process.
I don't think many Iowans would cry about that. There are some people who would probably be delighted if it took turns.
Go ahead.
I think the answer is when the person who loses Iowa becomes
I haven't gotten
president.
booed yet for saying that.
If Hillary Clinton had become president, she did not like the Iowa
Yes.
caucuses. She didn't think they were fair to her.
Right.
I think the
It would have
party
hastened it,
then
yeah.
would have changed the rules, but it worked out well for Senator Obama.
Yeah.
So yes, Iowa is not a beacon of diversity, but because he won in Iowa, that catapulted him as a winner. So let's just pull someone out of the hat. If Kamala Harris, for example, or Cory Booker would win the Iowa caucuses and go on to defeat Donald Trump, I think the Iowa caucuses would stay just where they are. So the reality is, if winners are controlling the rules,
Yes.
I think it will stay. But Jonathan's absolutely right. I mean, they're living on borrowed time. It's not a right. I think a lot of people think, oh, it just happens all the time. That's I don't think it will be forever.
But no, it's true, though. I think if Hillary had won, the Clintons had no love for Iowa, and I think it would have been really in doubt in the future, and that, ironically, may have preserved it for longer. Yeah. And Obama, too, absolutely. I think if Obama hadn't won here in 2008 and then used this as a springboard to prove to the broader pool of Democratic voters that white folks in the heartland will vote for me, I think
if you build a good campaign.
Yeah.
I think that is what every 2020 Democrat now is looking at. They're studying that campaign.
Obama's success preserved the caucuses for
I
at least
think so, because it did
10
fit
years.
into the community organizing type thing.
Right. Is that Buffett calling?
That is simply the alarm that says that we
That somebody
probably-
was questioning the Iowa caucuses there.
It reminds me that we've probably used up the formal time of the panel, but we still have some time for questions. So I'd like to thank the panel for this terrific analysis. And first of all, great job. And then I think there are microphones on both sides, and so we invite you to ask questions or make a comment. We will take away your microphone and take away your pass to the Great Hall if you disrupt us too much. No? We don't do that here. So please go ahead and find the microphone and share your views with us. I also want to take a second.
No members of my family are allowed to ask questions.
They're not. No. I want to also take just 1 second and say, if you can, take a look at the Lucan family example of what they've done with the endowment, with bringing us this event here, and see if you don't want to do something similar, because it's really terrific. It's great for democracy, it's great for political science, it's great for the university. And maybe you want to do it in some other field, physics, computer science, or some other area. But this is a lasting legacy that will really change the lives of hundreds or thousands of students. And we thank them so much for what they've done. So let's have a hand for the Lucan Endowment again. Who's moderating the questions? I can't see anybody out there. Yes.
I'm happy to go first. So I'm Jacob Martin. I'm in the political science department as a grad student. One thing I wanted to ask about that I didn't get a chance to earlier. So earlier today, there was a tweet from President Trump that talked about specifically CNN, but about the news media in general, and about the possibility of starting a national news source to counter what he would, I suppose, call fake news. So I figured, well, we have journalists here who could kind of offer a more full-throated defense of this. What would you say in response to something like that in preservation of the news media as it stands now?
Well, it was pretty striking to have a Republican president talking about wanting to start a state-run media outlet in order to compete with a private media outlet. But I would say the nation does seem to like divided government. You know, the Senate is GOP-controlled, the House is Democratic-controlled, and over history we have gone to that pattern many, many times. And it does seem like the people more and more like their media divided. They tend to, if you're on the left, you tend to watch certain TV stations or read certain newspapers. If you're on the right, you read different ones. And I do think that is troubling, and it would be refreshing to see media outlets that just really go straight down the middle and can appeal to both sides again.
I would just say it's not what the forefathers intended at all. And whenever anyone says that, like, what would you like, or if anyone says that's a good idea, would you like it if President Bernie Sanders did that? So the reality here is the great thing about the First Amendment in this country, you can choose your news outlet. And there certainly is one very popular cable channel that agrees with the president virtually all of the time. So the idea of creating a state-run news service, I think, would be a march toward a very different kind of democracy than was intended.
And Fox would be the first to oppose that, right? A national
One would
run.
think.
Yes, my question is about the 2020
Tiana.
election as far as the U.S. Senate is concerned. And it looks to me like the Democrats in 2020, maybe in 2022 for that matter, have an awfully steep hill to climb to recapture the U.S. Senate. And I look at, just my own very cursory observation. I can't see very many Republican-held seats in 2020 that would be in play. Maybe Colorado, maybe Maine. I think Joni Ernst is going to be awfully tough to beat. What do you think?
Yeah, it's, I was actually talking to a Democrat tonight about this, that, it's a tale of two cities. What propelled them to 40 seats in the House this year comes with a sort of, double edge to it. Their struggles in rural America have put the Senate further away. I can see a scenario where Democrats can take back the White House in 2020, retain control of the House, and because of their wins in governorships, are able to control the House for some time and create an enduring House majority and control the White House and not take back the Senate for some time. Because of these divides we're talking about tonight, just the nature of how the Senate is laid out, every state gets 2 seats. That makes the math very difficult for Democrats. I mentioned North Dakota earlier. This is remarkable to think about this. As recently as 2004, all 4 senators from the 2 Dakotas were Democrats. As recently as 2010, 5 of the 6 members of Congress from the 2 Dakotas were Democrats. Now, all 6 are Republicans. And so I think it's just harder for Democrats now to win back the Senate because of how the country is split. Look, I think they have a chance to beat Cory Gardner in Colorado. That's probably their top target. If Susan Collins retires, that obviously becomes the top target. After that, Tom Tillis in North Carolina could be potentially beatable, but there's not a lot of seats. You look at David Perdue in Georgia, maybe Abrams challenges him, but it's not a great map for Democrats in 2020. And if you assume that Doug Jones is really imperiled in Alabama, that could hand the Republicans 1 seat out of the gates. So I think it's possible that we could be looking at divided government for some time here because of these very divides.
During the midterms, Iowans switched two congressional seats from red to blue, but kept a Republican governor. Do you believe that this was a check on the Republicans at the national level, or do you believe there may have been some backlash from the Kavanaugh hearings that led people to believe, enough, we need a woman in charge? And what implications do you think this has on the 2020 race?
I think that, you had Democrats at the congressional level in Iowa won statewide by about 40,000 votes. Kim Reynolds won by about 40,000 votes, so an 80,000 vote difference between the federal races and the governor's race. Some of that is Steve King undervote and people who were Reynolds, Schulten voters. There was clearly that was a big part of it. I do think gender played a big role in this. I don't know that it had a lot to do with Kavanaugh. In fact, our polling got stronger throughout the process with Kavanaugh. It was a galvanizing moment for Republicans. You had already a 70 or 80% intensity among Democrats. Coming into the Kavanaugh hearings, Republicans were at about 55 or 60% intensity. We score voters, obviously, on how closely they're following the election. And Kavanaugh brought Republicans back to the table to really participate in the election. I think that the unique problem in Iowa for Democrats at the governor's level is that they nominated the wrong candidate. I think Fred Hubbell was just a uniquely poor candidate and did not connect with rural Iowa at all. When the results started coming in that night, 35,000 vote margin for the Democrats in Polk County, if you had told me Republicans were going to lose the 1st district, the 3rd district, and Steve King was going to win by 3, and yet Governor Reynolds was going to win, I would have said you were crazy. But then after Polk comes in, Johnson comes in, and then you see some of these rural counties coming. Governor Reynolds won counties, 45 counties, by more votes than Joni Ernst did in a 7-point victory over Bruce Braley in 2014 in a Republican wave year. So it was hyper boosted turnout among Republicans in rural counties to match the turnout among Democrats in the cities. And I just think that Fred Hubbell was a terrible candidate for rural Iowa for Democrats. He ran behind virtually every single one of his counterparts on the ballot at the federal level. So to me, and also I will say, Kim Reynolds was also a uniquely good candidate who connected well, who had a message, stayed on that message, performed well in the debates.
And just to point out that you worked for
I did work for the campaign, but I think
Great consultants, too.
In a governor's race, you're not looking at, it's not a check on the presidency.
But I think
that happens at Congress.
there's no doubt it was such a nationalized race. I think you would agree with this. What we saw in those the red to blue House seats, the same thing we saw in suburban districts across America. There was just a sense of the people who voted for President Trump in 2016 simply were, not enamored with his governing style and other things. So I think the suburbs in Iowa, they're not quite the same as places in, Ohio, Florida, whatever. But I think that there was a Trump effect.
No doubt. Dallas County normally would be a 9,000 or 10,000 vote margin for Republicans, was about 1,500 votes in 2018, and that was true in the smaller suburbs in other communities.
And the 2 House seats that flipped were both in districts with the largest cities in the state.
Right.
And the biggest suburbs.
And had the highest college graduation.
Yeah. So the statistics that you were talking about earlier definitely played a role in Iowa.
Right.
Let's ask Cottrell to make some news here tonight before we leave. Why don't we? Will Steve King be on the ballot on Election Day 2020 in
general
Iowa?
election?
Yes.
No.
Wow.
Because of being defeated in a primary or not running?
One or the other.
Good.
No, doesn't matter to me.
That's my kind of prediction. We have a question over here?
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, Jeff Corder, I'm an Iowa State graduate. Dave Cottrell and I cut our teeth in many campaigns, and Governor Branstad back in '86. I'm probably one of the few people in the room that is a Reagan-Kemp conservative. And for me, the dichotomy of President Trump is that from a policy standpoint, you can argue that he's been even more successful than President Reagan, with conservative judges, with deregulation, with tax cuts, with a strengthened military. And you'd think that somebody with that record after 2 years would be in the upper 50s on favorability, and yet he's a drag because obviously his personal conduct, which killed the Republicans in the suburbs around the country for the House. So my question is, knowing how the president is somewhat stuck in his ways, do you see a reasonable pivot that he can make to have a chance to get some of the suburban support back that Republicans lost so badly in this midterm?
Donald Trump is 71 years old. He's been playing the role of Donald Trump now for at least 30 years. And by that I mean this sort of outsized public celebrity, provocateur figure. It would seem far-fetched that he would change that persona in any appreciable way between now and 2020. I'm being very gentle here and very mild. No, I mean, it's really hard to see that he would change his stripes. And look, he's not a party guy, and I'm sure that he'll be, gently at first, and then probably less gently as 2020 gets closer to here, pressured by folks in the party to tone it down. I just don't think he cares. I don't think he's going to do that. And frankly, most of the base of the party doesn't want him to. And as long as they're cheering him on and packing arenas for his rallies, I don't think the pleas of party poobahs are going to matter all that much.
He does listen sometimes. You're exactly right. He's not going to change. But he has shown a tendency sometimes to listen to the party poobahs. Like, for example, they said, listen, if you fire your attorney general before
Correct,
the
yes.
midterms, it's going to be have a negative effect on House Republicans, and you would like to have Republicans keep the House. And so he did listen on that. And then
On discrete issues, he will restrain himself.
exactly,
Right.
and things like that. On immigration, so his pollsters were telling him, pound home that fearfulness of the illegal immigration problem. That will help you with voters. And so he listened to that and did that. Their polling showed that they were getting a Brett bounce from, the outrage over how Brett Kavanaugh was treated during the hearings. And so he listened to that, and he took that to heart, and he really tried to elevate that message. So on certain issues, he will listen. But how many times have people, including his own wife, said, honey, maybe you could not tweet and, not offend so many people, and he's never going to change that.
Yeah.
But with all that said, could still absolutely be reelected in 2020. I think as we sit here right now, everyone should be, honest and clear-eyed about that. See a previous conversation about the Democratic Party, the party identity crisis here. So, and I think the economy is a big thing, right? Add the economy and unemployment to the list of what you said of his accomplishments were, and it is extraordinary that his approval rating and things are where they are. But let's see where the economy is in a couple of years. But no, I don't think he'll change.
It's also important to remember that he's not really there for the agenda that you're talking about, Jeff. He is there. The Trump agenda and that Reagan-Kemp agenda are very distinct from each other. You got that agenda because you had a Republican Congress. You got it because executive authority is much greater than it was 30 years ago, so you can do so much more with the presidency. Just the expansion of presidential power has been, this ongoing march here over the last several decades. So he's not really an adherent to that agenda. In fact, I would posit that he would dump it in a heartbeat if he thought it would help him win in 2020. What I would view as an old Reagan-Kemp Republican as the benefits of a Trump presidency are really not first in his mind of what he wants to do. He's not interested in that kind of governing. He's interested in the conflict. He's interested in sort of the personality games that get played as a part of this. He likes to name people. He likes to pick on the Republicans that don't like him probably more than he likes to pick on the Democrats that don't like him. So I think we'll see this play out over the next couple of years. But to me, it really isn't about the agenda of lower taxes, less regulation, and nominating conservative judges. I think that you get that with the Trump presidency because he's got the pen and he's got executive authority and people around him that lead him in that direction.
Yeah. One more question.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a senior in journalism, so my question is kind of news-oriented. But do you see journalists covering the election in 2020 any differently than they have in 2018 or 2016 with a president who is constantly changing? You can't predict what he's going to be doing, matched with more diverse candidates running in most political races?
I think the coverage should be different in one respect. In one respect, it'll be covering President Trump as an incumbent, so he will have a record of which to be judged. I think a big part of campaign coverage that the media could do better on every cycle, and this will be my 6th presidential campaign I've covered, and I say this every time, but I think it is true again, is watching more what the voters and the people are saying. Now we have a roadmap to how President Trump was elected the first time, and that roadmap it does not look the same as it did in 2016 because of the 2018 elections, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. So for all the importance of Iowa, we'll see how important Iowa is in the general election. Democrats have not written it off, but it certainly is not mentioned in the trifecta of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But I think that it will be, covered in, a frenetic way in many respects. I'm guessing you've already seen changes in terms of what all of the cable networks do in terms of the amount of attention they give to Trump rallies. Even Fox News at the end was not covering his rallies in prime time, with few exceptions. For the last several weeks, they stopped airing those. During the campaign back in 2016, all of them were still being aired. So I do think there will be more of a judicious use of just broadcasting rallies on both sides. I think fact-checking has become more popular and much more important and necessary. So I think there'll be some differences, and it'll be just drinking out of a fire hose. But I always say, let's not forget the voters.
I'll just add really quickly, one thing, listening to voters is really important. And one thing I hear very frequently from Republican voters is they do feel like the media can be too fixated on being hypercritical of Trump. Now, that said, I think the journalists that cover the White House do a fantastic job, and they're some of the best reporters I've ever encountered, and I'm not criticizing any of my colleagues. They're amazing and rooting out unethical behavior and all the things that are happening behind the scenes that this administration doesn't want you to hear about. So they're amazing. But I do also hear a lot from Republicans that perhaps if the media were less shrill about calling Trump a liar when we're not certain if he had the intention to lie or was it just an embellishment and exaggeration as a political spin, the constant critiquing him, and I don't want to pick too much on the press, but I do know I had one White House official say, listen, if the media were a little less biased and if hard news reporters stayed in their lane and didn't express any opinions and left the opinions to just the opinion columnists, because a lot of Republicans tune out the mainstream media because of what's perceived as a liberal or a progressive spin in the news media. If we were to just play it straight down the middle, our coverage of Trump would be very, very damaging to them. And so they almost like the fact that they can come at the media for being biased and showing a bias, because if we played it straight, it would hurt Trump because there's so much damaging information that we could unearth about him.
Which is why he does it, right?
Exactly.
But
he discredits.
if I could differ a little bit with Jennifer, I think if we did play it straight, the coverage would be perceived as even nastier, more negative, more vicious toward the president. Because if we played it straight every day and covered this president like we did past presidents, every day would be full of banner headlines, breaking news alerts, breathless coverage in print and on TV, because no president has conducted himself this way. If Bush or Obama spent the first 4 to 5 hours of their day watching cable TV and tweeting back what they were seeing on TV, there would be stories from here to friggin' Seattle and back about what is going on with the President of the United States. They're watching cable TV for hours on end, and then they're on the internet, like, yelling at the TV. The coverage would be much, much, much tougher if this president was treated like past presidents. And the fact is that we have to basically compensate to accommodate how this president acts. Look, the president could go to these campaign rallies during the midterms and say things that were outrageous, including mocking Christine Blasey Ford testimony, as he did in South Haven, Mississippi. The coverage the next day, not from you guys, but the coverage the next day overwhelmingly in the local paper would be Trump stumps for a local candidate. It didn't matter what he said or how extreme or factually challenged the things he said were. The coverage would still be jammed into the architecture of the coverage that we know, which is Trump stumps today for Senate candidate X and says X, Y, Z. It wouldn't be in an extraordinary turn of events. The President of the United States tonight lied 14 different times, because we can't do that, because then we are doing what you're talking about, which is sort of playing into the hands of the president's supporters. He's made it very difficult on us to do our jobs because of how he conducts himself. And I think playing it straight would be much tougher on him.
But again, that's the point, right?
Yeah.
He's conducting this, entire orchestra for that effect. By injecting, we've never seen someone control the news cycle or try and turn the news cycle or other things. And so many
his words almost matter less. Because, look, if the President of the United States had said, I want to create a new television network, a state-owned television network, and let's say it was Reagan or 41 or Clinton or Obama, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that my paper tomorrow, the Washington Post, the LA Times, would have a large story the next day above the fold saying the President of the United States on Monday floated creating a state news network. Yeah. I don't think any of those papers I just mentioned will have any mention of it tomorrow on the front page.
Because there was too much competing news of
Why is
the
that?
other unusual things that he said and did today.
Because
It's because we're all numb.
Why?
Because he throws so much at you so constantly
You overwhelm the
that
system.
He's flooded the zone, and there's no more to do with it.
And you've got to pick out which of those things is the most consequential, which is not just him blustering, but which actually does have some real consequential impact. And that is tough. And by the way, these guys do a great job. It's not easy. It's got to be the hardest president to cover in a long time because of this.
I traveled with him to California. He just went out to Paradise, California to witness the destruction from the wildfires. And it was a 19-hour day for us, and in those 19 hours from DC to 2 places in California and back, he came and gaggled with the press 6 times. And at the end of the 6th time, one of my colleagues turned to me and said, I've just run out of questions. I don't know what else to ask the guy. And we just can't write another. We've already filed 6 news stories out of the things we've asked him today. And he kind of jokingly said, enough. But he loves talking to the media. He wants to control the narrative, and actually Sarah Huckabee Sanders briefed us 3 times that day. So even though I do miss the press briefings that Jeff and I are always sitting in on, we do hear a lot from this president and do get briefed privately more than people might realize.
And with that, I want to tell you what we're going to do now. We're going to decommission our microphones, come out of that door there, and if any of you would like to talk to any of us, I think we've agreed that we'll take a few minutes. You can chat with us a little bit. But of course, I want to thank this wonderful panel for fabulous discussion tonight. No fake news here whatsoever. So thank you, people.